Welcome to the Trackpads Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The story of irregular warfare in the Second World War begins not with a clash of tanks on open plains, but in the silence of a midnight landscape where front lines did not exist. Imagine the forested marshes of Belarus, where the howl of wolves masked the sound of explosives laid beneath a railway track. Picture the high plateaus of the French Alps, where resistance fighters lit clandestine fires to guide Allied aircraft toward a drop zone. Visualize waves crashing against the cliffs of Normandy as small boats disgorged men carrying rope ladders, ready to claw their way up sheer rock in the face of enemy fire. These were not the set-piece battles of Stalingrad or El Alamein. They were raids, ambushes, and acts of sabotage that blurred the lines of war, forcing powerful armies to fight shadows as much as enemies in uniform. Irregular fighters came from different nations and backgrounds, yet they shared a common trait, an ability to bend the battlefield to their will. Soviet partisans turned swamps and forests into weapons, derailing trains and choking German supply lines. The French Maquis, scattered and ill-equipped, carved out sanctuaries in mountains and valleys, tying down German divisions with roadblocks and ambushes. Across the sea, American Rangers emerged as an elite formation within a conventional army, scaling cliffs, seizing ports, and daring to infiltrate enemy lines where others would falter. Each fought in environments that conventional armies found hostile, using terrain and surprise to achieve results far greater than their numbers might suggest. Their impact was not measured in territory held, but in time stolen, resources diverted, and morale shaken. The difference between these irregulars and regular armies was not just their scale, but their philosophy. Large formations sought to dominate ground through mass, firepower, and logistics. Guerrillas and raiders sought instead to deny security, to unbalance the rhythm of an enemy, to prove that no rear area was safe. They thrived on audacity, their victories born from boldness rather than certainty. This meant their lives were precarious, defined by scarcity, hunger, and danger at every turn. Yet, it also meant their actions carried weight disproportionate to their size, each act of sabotage rippling through an enemy command structure that had to account for threats everywhere. In this way, irregular warfare stretched the war's geography, making it a conflict where maps could never fully capture the true shape of the front. The story that follows is a journey through these landscapes and experiences. From the forests of the Soviet Union to the mountains of France, from the cliffs of Normandy to the gorges of the Balkans, we will trace how irregular fighters challenged powerful armies and altered the tempo of campaigns. We will examine not only their tactics but the human dimension, the leaders who organized them, the soldiers who endured hunger and exhaustion, and the civilians who paid the price for supporting them. This is not a tale of sweeping offensives marked by arrows on maps, but of scattered sparks of defiance that burned bright enough to bend history. In these accounts, we see how irregular warfare forced conventional armies to redraw boundaries, rethink strategies, and fight a war on terms they had not anticipated. The swamps and forests of the Soviet Union became the crucible, in which irregular warfare reached a strategic scale. The Pripyat marshes stretched for hundreds of miles, an endless wilderness of reeds, bogs, and dark waterways. German divisions found movement nearly impossible, their vehicles sinking into mud during the Rasputitsa, when spring thaw and autumn rains transformed roads into rivers of muck. Yet what hobbled mechanized armies offered sanctuary to those who knew the terrain. Soviet partisans melted into this environment, their camps hidden beneath the canopy, their paths invisible to outsiders. Every bridge, culvert, and rail line became a potential ambush point. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against the occupier, turning marches into slogs and patrols into ordeals. Against this backdrop, partisans launched a war of sabotage that forced the Wehrmacht to divert manpower and energy into a rear that was never secure. The early partisan bands were composed of stragglers from shattered Soviet units, escaped prisoners, and villagers unwilling to submit. At first they were poorly armed, surviving on captured rifles and the goodwill of sympathetic peasants. But by 1942, the Soviet state recognized their potential and began forging them into brigades tied directly to the Red Army. Radios parachuted in from Moscow linked forest camps to divisional headquarters hundreds of miles away. Operations were no longer random outbursts of defiance, but carefully timed blows against German supply lines. The campaign known as the Rail War epitomized this shift. Partisans mined tracks and bridges in unison with frontline offensives, derailing trains and forcing reinforcements to halt, just as Soviet armies attacked. Each explosion was a signal that the front was not a line, but a web, stretching far into enemy-occupied territory. The German response was as ruthless as it was relentless. Security divisions and SS battalions scoured the forests, employing scorched earth tactics designed to starve the resistance. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, their inhabitants executed or deported. Yet this brutality often had the opposite effect, convincing survivors that resistance was the only option. For the Germans, the numbers told the story. Every time a section of track was repaired, another was blown apart. Trains had to travel at reduced speeds, guarded by heavily armed escorts, which in turn drained divisions from the front lines. The Wehrmacht, already overextended on the vast Eastern Front, found itself bleeding strength into an endless war of security and reprisal. The Irregulars, armed with explosives and patience, were bending the logistics that sustained entire armies. Life for the Partisans was a constant test of willpower. Fighters lived in dugouts carved into the earth, their walls lined with pine branches to keep out the cold. Food was scarce. Potatoes and bread stolen from fields or shared by villagers kept them alive. Medical care was primitive, with makeshift bandages and forest herbs substituting for proper supplies. Women and teenagers carried explosives as often as rifles, laying mines along tracks before vanishing into the night. Despite hunger, disease, and ceaseless danger, morale persisted. Every successful derailment proved that even in the depths of occupation, the Soviet people were striking back. The Partisans embodied the idea that the front was everywhere, that a tank army advancing hundreds of miles away depended on rails and roads vulnerable to a single sapper in a swamp. Their war was not about territory held, but about denying the enemy certainty, turning his rear into a battlefield he could never control. The high plateaus of southeastern France became symbols of both resistance and sacrifice. In the Haute-Savoie, the plateau of Glières rose above valleys threaded with forests and ravines, a natural stronghold where the French Maquis gathered in 1944. Its cliffs and ridges made it a fortress in miniature, easily defended but difficult to escape once surrounded. Fighters huddled in mountain farms and caves, waiting for Allied aircraft to drop containers by night. Signal fires marked landing zones, and every delivery of rifles, Sten guns, and mortars gave new life to the scattered bands of resistors. The plateau became more than a base. It was a statement that France, though occupied, was not conquered. Yet the very terrain that offered protection also risked entrapment. For once German columns advanced up the narrow roads, retreat paths narrowed into bottlenecks, where survival depended on speed and luck. Leadership within the Maquis reflected the diversity of its ranks. Local farmers and veterans of the 1940 defeat stood alongside students, escaped prisoners, and men avoiding forced labor in Germany. Allied agents parachuted in, bringing radios, demolition training, and coded instructions from London. Messages slipped through the BBC carried simple phrases that meant everything: an instruction to cut a railway, to ambush a convoy, or to prepare for an airdrop. In this web of communication, small groups became part of a continental campaign. Roadblocks built from felled trees and mines planted along curves slowed German reinforcements headed to Normandy. A convoy delayed for hours on a mountain road might arrive too late to stem an Allied advance far away. For the Maquis, such acts were proof that even lightly armed irregulars could shape the tempo of war beyond their valleys. But their audacity invited retaliation. At Vercors, a vast plateau near Grenoble, resistance leaders declared a Free Republic in July 1944, inspired by the Allied landings in Normandy. They hoped to hold ground as a liberated zone until reinforcements arrived. Instead, the Germans launched a coordinated assault. Paratroopers descended from gliders onto the plateau itself, bypassing defenses the Maquis believed impassable. Mountain troops pressed up the roads, artillery pounded villages, and reprisals swept across the valleys. Entire communities were burned, civilians executed, and the plateau drowned in blood. The dream of Vercors became a warning. Irregulars could harass, sabotage, and ambush, but when they tried to hold fixed ground against an organized army, the cost was catastrophic. The defeat underscored the limits of resistance when it stepped outside the shadows. For the Maquisards, daily life was as harsh as any frontline trench. Food was scarce, meals often reduced to bread and thin soup. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet, with captured German weapons treasured as prizes. Fighters slept in barns, under canvas, or in caves, their sleep broken by the fear of betrayal or surprise attack. Yet moments of triumph sustained them. An ambush that routed a convoy, the arrival of parachutes under moonlight, the raising of a flag in a liberated town square. Their struggle embodied resilience, though often crushed in battle. Their persistence forced German commanders to commit troops and energy into mountain chases rather than coastal defenses. Even in defeat, the Maquis bent the front, proving that occupation could never rest easy, and that resistance, though fragile, was unrelenting. The American Rangers were born of a simple idea, that small, highly trained units could achieve outsized results by striking where the enemy least expected. Modeled on Britain's commandos, they were forged under the leadership of William O. Darby, who demanded endurance, initiative, and audacity from his men. Their training in the Scottish Highlands and on windswept coasts emphasized night navigation, cliff assaults, and amphibious raids. Volunteers learned to move silently, to strike swiftly, and to survive without heavy support. This ethos created an elite within the U.S. Army, soldiers who saw themselves as the spear tip of Allied operations. Their first test came in November 1942 at Arzew, Algeria, when Rangers slipped into darkness to seize coastal batteries guarding a harbor. In minutes, they silenced guns that might have devastated the landings of Operation Torch, proving that a few determined men could open doors for entire armies. The Mediterranean campaigns expanded their legend. In Sicily, Rangers waded ashore under starlight, climbing cliffs and clearing villages before dawn. In Italy, they fought through narrow streets and rugged ridgelines, mastering environments where armor was useless and infantry fought house to house. Their ability to move swiftly through coastal towns and over difficult terrain allowed them to spearhead landings, seize key positions, and disrupt defenders before larger forces arrived. Each success added to their reputation, but it also built a dangerous expectation that Rangers could succeed regardless of odds, that their daring alone could overturn defenses designed to repel divisions. As the war pressed forward, this reputation brought them missions where risk outweighed numbers, where boldness became a double-edged sword. The defining moment of their war came at Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions faced the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, a daunting rise of sheer rock bristling with enemy fire. Their mission was to scale the heights under fire, destroy heavy guns positioned to sweep Omaha Beach, and hold the ground until relieved. Battling waves, seasickness, and German grenades tossed down from above, the Rangers clawed upward on ropes and ladders, some collapsing into the surf before reaching the top. When they crested the cliff, they discovered the guns had been moved inland. The mission pivoted from an assault to a search, culminating in the discovery and destruction of the guns hidden nearby. Though costly and chaotic, the operation ensured that thousands of troops landing below were spared enfilade fire. Pointe du Hoc became legend, a symbol of American grit broadcast across the world, even if its practical effect was smaller than the story told. Not all Ranger missions carried triumph. In January 1944, during the Anzio campaign, 2 battalions attempted to infiltrate German lines at Cisterna. Expecting weak opposition, they instead encountered well-prepared defenders in strength. Encircled and cut off, the Rangers fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Nearly 800 men were killed or captured, the regiment effectively destroyed. It was a sobering lesson in the limits of irregular tactics when applied against entrenched enemies without sufficient support. Cisterna revealed that even the most elite units could be undone by flawed intelligence and overconfidence. The sacrifice was devastating, but it reshaped how commanders viewed the employment of specialized forces. Rangers were not blunt instruments to be hurled at impossible tasks. They were precision tools requiring careful application. For the Rangers themselves, the experience was one of extremes. They endured bone-chilling surf and rope burns from cliff assaults, the claustrophobia of fighting room to room, and the grim knowledge that they were often the first into the line of fire. Casualty rates were high, and each mission carried the burden of being expendable for a larger cause. Yet camaraderie grew fierce, bonds forged in shared hardship and survival against odds. They saw themselves as inheritors of a tradition of audacity, proud of their role, despite the costs. Their story illustrated both the power and peril of irregular methods within a conventional army. By their courage, they bent front lines. By their losses, they reminded commanders of the fine line between boldness and folly. The Balkans were a battlefield unlike any other in Europe, a maze of mountains, gorges, and valleys where conventional armies found movement painfully slow and guerrillas seemed to vanish at will. Yugoslavia, under Axis occupation, became the epicenter of this irregular struggle. From the rugged Dinaric Alps to the karst plateaus, the terrain provided endless sanctuaries and ambush sites. In these inhospitable landscapes, Josip Broz Tito transformed a scattered resistance into one of the most formidable partisan movements of the war. Front lines drawn on German maps meant little here. Villages could be liberated one week, retaken the next, and lost again days later. For Tito's partisans, mobility was everything, and the geography of Yugoslavia allowed them to slide across rivers, scale ridges, and vanish into forests where pursuit was futile. Their presence turned the Balkans into a theater of perpetual uncertainty, draining Axis strength and stretching their resources across terrain that defied control. Leadership was the crucial ingredient that gave coherence to this shifting war. Tito balanced ideology with pragmatism, ensuring that his movement carried a political message of national liberation while never neglecting battlefield survival. Discipline kept units intact despite the hardships of guerrilla life. At the same time, Tito welcomed Allied advisors, British, American, and Soviet, who parachuted in with radios, supplies, and liaison channels to the wider war effort. These relationships enhanced his credibility abroad, but never overshadowed his independence. He commanded not just a resistance but a proto-state in arms, with an organizational structure that rivaled conventional armies. His insistence on unity set his movement apart from other partisan groups in Europe, which often fractured along ideological or regional lines. Under Tito, Yugoslav resistance was more than survival. It was transformation into a national army in the making. The tactics employed by the partisans grew in sophistication as their ranks swelled. At first, ambushes and rail sabotage mirrored the efforts of partisans elsewhere, but soon they mounted larger operations, capturing towns, seizing garrisons, and then melting back into the mountains before counterattacks arrived. The battles of the Neretva and Suceska in 1943 epitomized this evolution. Surrounded by Axis offensives designed to crush them, the partisans executed daring breakouts, maneuvering across rivers under fire and slipping through mountain passes against overwhelming odds. Casualties were high, but survival itself was victory. These operations showcased resilience that baffled Axis commanders, who threw divisions into the Balkans only to see their efforts fail. Each failed encirclement underscored the impossibility of imposing order on a movement that thrived on mobility, knowledge of terrain, and sheer willpower. Axis reprisals were ferocious, villages were burned, civilians massacred, and collaborators recruited to aid German sweeps. Scorched earth tactics aimed to sever the partisans from their civilian lifeline. Yet every act of terror deepened resentment, driving more people to Tito's banners. Women joined the movement in unprecedented numbers, serving as couriers, nurses, and frontline fighters. Songs and symbols knitted fighters together, creating a shared identity that transcended hardship. Mule trains carried weapons and food across mountain paths, while hidden hospitals under pine canopies treated the wounded with improvised tools. The soldier's life was one of ceaseless marches, sudden skirmishes, and nights under cold stars, but it was also one of conviction that their fight would shape Yugoslavia's future and redeem its suffering. By the later stages of the war, Tito's forces were no longer a guerrilla movement in the strict sense. They fielded divisions capable of conventional operations, liberating swaths of territory even before Allied armies approached the Balkans. Their campaigns bent Axis front lines into knots, forcing the Germans to allocate divisions to a theater they could ill afford to reinforce. The Yugoslav partisans stood as a striking example of how irregular warfare, given strong leadership and favorable terrain, could evolve into a national force that changed the balance of an entire region. Their struggle was not only about resistance, it was about rewriting the map of Europe from within its mountains. All across occupied Europe, resistance movements grew more effective when they linked themselves to Allied strategy through the presence of advisors. British Special Operations executive agents, American OSS operatives, and multinational Jedburgh teams parachuted into forests and fields, carrying radios, demolition charges, and the promise of connection to something greater. These men and women were lifelines, enabling scattered guerrilla bands to act not in isolation but as part of coordinated offensives. A coded phrase broadcast over the BBC might seem trivial to an unsuspecting listener, but for fighters in the hills, it was the signal to cut a rail line or to prepare for an airdrop. In this way, local acts of sabotage became synchronized, with vast operations stretching across continents, folding irregulars into the same strategic design that governed divisions and armies. The destruction of infrastructure became a deliberate campaign. Bridges collapsed under the weight of explosives. Railways were torn up, and culverts were blown apart at critical moments. In France, the run-up to D-Day saw entire regions paralyzed by derailments and blockages, delaying reinforcements from reaching Normandy. In the Balkans, partisans demolished key bridges across gorges, forcing the Axis to dedicate thousands of troops to guarding routes that were once considered secure. Even in Central Europe, resistance cells turned transport networks into unreliable lifelines, slowing the movement of entire divisions. What made these actions powerful was their timing. An explosion here, a delay there, all carefully orchestrated to coincide with Allied offensives. What looked like chaos was, in reality, an extension of strategic planning carried out by men and women hidden in forests and barns. Keeping these operations alive required their own form of logistics supply chains of the shadows. Allied aircraft flew under moonlight, releasing containers into fields lit by signal lamps, delivering rifles, ammunition, radios, and medical supplies. Caches were hidden in caves or beneath hay in barns, parceled out with strict care. Medical improvisation was constant. Wounds stitched in kitchens, infections fought with herbs when penicillin ran short, and stretcher-bearers guiding the wounded across mountain passes to safety. Beyond supplies for fighters, networks formed to smuggle downed Allied airmen out of occupied territory, guiding them through chains of safe houses and across the Pyrenees or Alps. Every successful escape and every parachute drop tied these guerrilla wars to the broader Allied effort, reinforcing morale and proving to isolated groups that their sacrifices were part of something immense. Yet this partnership was fraught with dilemmas. Allied commanders worried that uprisings launched too early would provoke devastating reprisals without altering the balance of power. Rival resistance groups often fought each other as fiercely as they fought the occupier, divided by ideology, ambition, or ethnic tension. Advisors on the ground struggled to balance local enthusiasm with strategic caution, sometimes ordering fighters to hold back when all they wanted was to strike. The moral weight was crushing. Every destroyed bridge risked retaliation. Every ambush might bring down massacres upon villages. Still, fighters accepted this risk, driven by belief that their actions hastened liberation. In this uneasy alliance, The tension between strategy and sacrifice played out daily, with each decision weighed against the potential cost in blood. By 1944 and 1945, the impact of this deep fight could no longer be dismissed. German divisions moved more slowly, convoys stalled, and repair crews worked without rest, only to see their efforts undone again. Reports flowed upward describing supply delays, attacks from nowhere, and an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere. Resistance was no longer a nuisance. It was a force multiplier for Allied armies advancing on all fronts. In tying down troops, disrupting timetables, and amplifying deception operations, irregular fighters proved that they were no longer fighting a local war. They had become an essential part of the orchestration of victory, their sabotage and endurance echoing across continents in the grand symphony of liberation. For the men and women who waged war in the shadows, the experience was far more personal than any staff officer's report could convey. To be a partisan, a Maquis or a ranger meant living constantly on edge, where every meal was uncertain and every night carried the possibility of betrayal. Soviet fighters in the forests rose each morning to the smell of damp earth and pine sap, their dugouts cold and crowded, their rations meager. French resistors in the mountains scouted winding roads with the knowledge that one collaborator's whisper could summon an entire German column. American rangers stepped into landing craft with the knowledge that they were chosen to go first, to climb cliffs or clear strong points where casualties would be highest. This psychological weight, knowing that survival was uncertain, that odds were often against them, defined their service as much as any tactical success. Fear was a constant companion, but it was tempered by a deep sense of camaraderie. Fighters learned to depend on each other in ways that blurred the line between comradeship and family. A Soviet teenager laying mines alongside veterans, a French farmer teaching a parachuted agent the local dialect, or an American ranger pulling his exhausted friend up a rope ladder. These moments bound them together. Their reliance on each other was absolute, for in the shadows, trust was the only shield against despair. The knowledge that betrayal could come from within the community, or even the family, only deepened these bonds among those who chose to fight. For many, the friendships forged in this clandestine world outlasted the war itself, etched into memory alongside the hardships endured. The physical toll of this life was relentless. Partisans trudged through snow and mud until boots fell apart, hunger gnawed their stomachs, and disease claimed nearly as many lives as bullets. Maquis carried outdated weapons with limited ammunition, rationing every round, and treating even a captured German rifle as a prize beyond value. Rangers, trained to a razor's edge, endured surf-soaked uniforms and the burns of ropes tearing skin during cliff climbs. Injuries lingered, scars became permanent, and exhaustion became a constant baseline. Yet these conditions also hardened them, creating a resilience that surprised even their enemies. German reports often remarked on the tenacity of captured fighters, men and women who endured interrogation with the same defiance they showed in ambushes. Hardship was their daily lot, but it became a source of strength rather than weakness. Moments of triumph pierced this hardship, like flashes of light. A successful ambush that derailed a train, a parachute drop that delivered weapons into waiting hands, or the raising of a tricolor flag in a liberated village square, all gave meaning to their struggle. These victories were rarely permanent, often followed by retreat or reprisal, but their psychological power was immense. They reminded fighters and civilians alike that the occupier was not invincible, that resistance had teeth, and that liberation was not just a distant hope. For the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the sight of destroyed enemy guns was vindication for the lives risked climbing those cliffs. For the Maquis, even temporary control of a town proved that France's heart still beat. For Soviet partisans, each wrecked rail line was proof that the Red Army's advance was aided by their unseen hands. What bound all these experiences together was a conviction that their sacrifices mattered beyond the local skirmish or raid. Partisans and rangers alike believed that their actions bent the larger war, forcing powerful armies to shift resources, redraw plans, and lose time. That belief gave them the endurance to march hungry, to fight with inadequate weapons, and to survive in landscapes that seemed hostile to human life. For many, recognition would come only later, if at all, but the sense of contributing to liberation sustained them in the moment. They lived and fought in the margins of history, but in those margins they carved stories of courage that rippled outward, shaping the tide of war itself. The legacy of the Partisans, the Maquis, and the Rangers rests not only in the battles they fought, but in the way they redefined what it meant to wage war. They proved that small units, deeply rooted in terrain and sustained by audacity, could bend the course of entire campaigns. Their actions forced powerful armies to guard their rears, to allocate divisions to security instead of the front, and to live in constant uncertainty. In forests, mountains, and coastal cliffs, they stretched the geography of war far beyond conventional lines. The Soviet partisan campaigns showed how guerrillas could become an arm of strategy. The Maquis demonstrated the will of a people to resist despite overwhelming odds. The Rangers embodied the potential of elite units to strike at the edges of empires. Together, they revealed that irregular warfare was not a sideshow but a decisive factor in shaping the flow of the conflict. The post-war world absorbed these lessons into doctrine. The Rangers, though nearly destroyed at Cisterna, were reborn as a permanent part of the U.S. Army, evolving into a cornerstone of modern special operations. Resistance networks in Europe inspired the creation of forces dedicated to unconventional warfare, leading to the eventual rise of units like the U.S. Special Forces. The Soviet Union, having seen the strategic value of partisans, incorporated partisan operations into its military thought, preparing for future conflicts by embedding irregular warfare into doctrine. Even NATO and Warsaw Pact strategies during the Cold War reflected this inheritance, envisioning partisan movements behind enemy lines as integral to the balance of power. What was once improvised survival became institutionalized as strategy. Yet alongside these military legacies came enduring dilemmas. The moral cost of irregular war reprisals against civilians, divisions among rival groups, and the dangers of relying on loosely controlled fighters remained unresolved. These questions surfaced again in later conflicts, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, where irregulars were both assets and liabilities. The same qualities that made partisans effective independence, adaptability, and deep ties to local populations also made them unpredictable allies. Commanders learned that irregular warfare could never be entirely controlled. It could only be guided, at times supported, but never fully contained. The legacy, therefore, was not just tactical or strategic, but ethical, reminding future generations of the human price hidden within the victories of irregular fighters. Above all, the story of these men and women endures because it is human. In the forests of Belarus, the plateaus of France, the cliffs of Normandy, and the gorges of Yugoslavia, ordinary people endured hunger, fear, and hardship for causes larger than themselves. Their battles may not always appear in the great atlases of the war, but their influence bent those maps just the same. They remind us that history is not only shaped by divisions on parade grounds, but also by small groups who refuse to yield, who strike in the dark, and who hold the belief that resistance, however fragile, can shift the course of nations. Their courage remains a testament to the idea that irregular warfare, though born in desperation, can alter the destiny of entire wars.
Thank you for joining us on the Trackpads Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.